My name is Marwan Hadeh. I'm a senior program manager on the Microsoft Flow team. I've been with the Flow team since the very conception, a little over a year and a half ago, and boy, have we grown in the past year and a half. It's been an amazing journey. Before joining the Flow team, I was on the Power Apps team, and prior to that, I was in Visual Studio. So before we talk about the agenda and before we start rolling, I wanted to cover what we're going to do today in terms of objectives and takeaways. So first and foremost, we want you to understand that Microsoft Flow is the successor to SharePoint Designer workflows. And we're going to show you why that's the case. We're going to deep dive into a few examples and see how using the SharePoint connector and the modern approvals experiences that are part of Flow, you can address common SharePoint Designer workflow scenarios. We'll also learn more about the Flow integration in SharePoint lists and libraries and how you can make use of that. And we'll learn more about Flow features like approvals, parallel flows, how you can configure run after type of actions, and we'll learn more about how you can set an explicit expiry. But most importantly, we want you to be able to spread the real story and not fake news. OK, so we'll start off by doing a little bit of context setting. What is Flow, and how does it stand with regards to products like Power Apps and Power BI? How does SharePoint view this family of products, Power Apps and Flow? We'll talk about how you can do more with approvals and SharePoint. And then we'll spend the majority of today's session looking at a variety of demos. We'll talk about demos that involve approvals on selected items, approvals that run sequentially, parallel approvals, as well as an approval which sends a ping and escalates when somebody doesn't reply. We'll round off things by looking at a comparison between Microsoft Flow and SharePoint Designer. And finally, we'll have a roadmap as well of things to come both at a product level as well as at the SharePoint Flow level. So let's get our bearings. So you've probably heard us say this over and over again, and if any of you have attended sessions by the Power Apps team or the Flow team, you'll know what I'm referring to here. Now, every modern business takes care of three main things about their business. One is measuring. You want to know how your business is doing. Once you have a sense of how things are going, how processes are performing, you then want to act on those processes. Maybe you want to input data, maybe you want to get data out, etc. And finally, you have the act of automation. So once things are going, once you have a pipeline set up, you want to do things faster and more efficiently. And to map to each of those activities that you would normally do, we have offerings that are geared towards power users, as well as those that are offered for developers. So in terms of measuring, we have Power BI. In terms of allowing people to act, we have Power Apps. And finally, in terms of automating, we have Microsoft Flow. Power BI has a pro offering called Pro BI, and Microsoft Flow has a pro offering called Logic Apps. Now, the secret sauce that's powering all of these products is at the very bottom. So we have connectors and gateways. So a connector is really a REST service that each of these products connects to and can pull data and push data to. A couple of the most important connectors for us is SharePoint and the Common Data Service. Now, using a gateway, you can connect to data that lives on-premise. So you can connect to your data that's on SharePoint Server 2012, your data that's in SQL, or even if you write a custom API and your data lives somewhere on-premise. OK, so how do we fit in with the larger landscape of SharePoint and Office 365? So the idea is that InfoPath and SharePoint, InfoPath and Workflow Designer were great products. They'll continue to be supported until 2026. But Power Apps and Flow are the successors to InfoPath and SharePoint Designer workflow moving forward. And what that means is, as you build out your new workflow scenarios, use Flow. As you're building out new form scenarios, use Power Apps. And we're working very closely with the SharePoint team to make sure that there is a parity as you move from one product over to the latest product. OK, so what is Flow? Microsoft Flow helps non-developers, power users, citizen developers to work smarter by automating workflows across your favorite apps and services. With Flow, for example, you can get notifications. Every time a new file is added to SharePoint, you can get an email with details about that file. If, for example, your manager sends you an email, you can set up push notifications on your mobile device so that you get details about the mail that was just sent to you. You can also use Flow to copy files. So for example, imagine that you upload a file to a particular folder in, let's say, OneDrive for Business. You can set up a flow such that that file is automatically copied to another folder in SharePoint so that the rest of your team has access to it. You can also use Flow to collect data. For example, you can set up a flow that collects tweets, let's say about hashtag MSIgnite, run some sentiment analysis on it to detect whether it's positive or negative, and then finally put it into a SQL database, to which you can then tie a visualization tool like Power BI and spot trends over time. Lastly, and most importantly, you can use Flow to automate approvals. And this automation applies to not just data in SharePoint, but also in Dynamics CRM, in Salesforce, in SQL, and you name it. For example, you could set up a flow such that whenever a new vacation request is added to, let's say, a list in SharePoint, you can send an approval request to a manager. That manager gets an approval request on their phone, they get it in their email inbox, and they also see it in the approval center, where once they go in and approve, they can type in a comment, and that comment is piped through to the person that requested that vacation request. And we'll look at examples of each of these in detail. So let's talk a little bit about what makes up a flow. Now, flow is built on two fundamental concepts. One is a trigger. So that's the event that kicks off the flow. Now, triggers can be of three forms. One is it could be manually started. Now, this could be a button that gets pressed. It could be a button in a Power App. It could also be a physical button with BTTN and Flick. A flow can also be run on a schedule, daily, weekly, monthly, etc. And lastly, a flow can be run based on an event in the cloud. So for example, when a new record is created in Dynamics 365, a new lead, let's say, you can then send an email. Now, an email is an action. So it's what the flow does when the trigger condition is met. And typically, actions use data from the trigger. So in this case, I'm sending an email based on a new lead. I'm sending it to the owner of the lead. And in the email body, I'm including things like the topic as well as the last name of the lead. Now, with Flow, you can connect to over 170 out-of-box connectors. And really, this is a number that keeps on growing. In fact, I had to update my slide last night because it was 150 a couple of weeks ago. And out of nowhere, it was 170. Now, if those 170 connectors, if you find a connector that we don't offer, you can build your own using custom connectors. Or if you have data that is very particular to your business or that lives on-premise, again, custom connectors is the way to go. You can connect to any custom REST endpoint and have it show up both in Flow as well as Power Apps. And you can also connect your on-premises data using gateways. So how do you get started? We have dozens and dozens of templates for every single service in Flow. The idea behind a template is that it's a flow that's pretty much ready to go. All you have to do is come in, give your credentials, tell us which account you're using, tell us which folder to point to, which site, etc. And the flow is pretty much all set. And we'll look at a few templates in detail. OK, so I'm going to show you our first demo, which is getting started with a template. And what we'll do in terms of our demos is we'll start from some of the more easier ones, and then we'll ramp up and get into more complex ones. Before I do that, how many of you have used Flow before? How many of you used one or more flows? OK, so quite a few of you, which is great. OK. Waiting for the screen to show up here. And it's the wrong input. There we go. OK. So I'm here on the Flow website, flow.microsoft.com. This is the home page here. As I can see, I can work less and do more. I'm all about working less, all about doing more. Here you can select from template collections based on our vertical, marketing, HR, software development, education, etc. You can see the most recent services, you can learn more about key features in Flow, and at the very bottom, you see a set of templates that you can use to get started with using the product. In this case, I'm going to choose a second template here, which sends me a push notification whenever I receive an email from my boss. So here I can see a description, I can see which services it's using, and it also prompts me for my credentials. So it says this flow will connect to Office 365 Outlook, Office 365 users, as well as notifications. Now, that's a really important part about Flow. Our philosophy is that Flow helps you automate anything that you would do manually. And when you do things manually, you're logging in with your own credentials. So similarly in Flow, whatever we do using your credentials. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and click Create Flow. And just like that, the flow is ready to go. I didn't have to enter anything because the inputs were so simple in this case. I have this flow that's already going to start monitoring my inbox and sending me push notifications whenever my boss emails me. So let's drill down into what this flow looks like. So let me go ahead and click Edit Flow. Here, what's happening is whenever a new email is sent to my inbox, I'm first going to get my profile. I'm then going to get my manager's profile using my identity. And then I have a condition here which checks whether the email that just came in is from my manager. If it is, it's going to send a push notification which says boss said, and then has the subject of whatever my boss said. So let me go ahead and click Update Flow. And let's send an email to this demo user, Chris, from his manager's account. OK. So I'm going to send an email to Chris. And I'm going to say, I need you to attach a cover sheet to your TPS report. Did you get the memo? Do you need me to send it again? OK. So let me go ahead and send that. Now what's happening is, as soon as that email is received, the flow is going to detect that an email is received, check whether that email was from my manager. In this case, it was from Jason, who is my manager, and it's going to send a push notification to my mobile device. And I'll just switch to my mobile phone real quickly to show you that notification come in. And there you go. And this is done using the Flow mobile app. So if I unlock, so in the Flow mobile app, you can not only see your notifications, you can receive notifications, you can also monitor the health of your flows. So here you can see how frequently these flows have run. You can turn them on, turn them off, delete them. You can add co-owners, etc. You can also see your approval requests if you have any, pending. OK. So that's how you get started with Flow. But how do you do more? Using approvals and SharePoint. Now, each and every one of us is here today because of an approval, because our managers or the powers that be said that we could come in and attend this conference. Approval processes are an integral part of all businesses. And this ranges from HR request forms for vacation, for travel authorization, for travel expenses, for mileage reimbursement, etc., to document approvals for contracts, for specs, for designs, sales, etc. Approvals can also be used for issue tracking. For example, let's say a new issue shows up in one of your forums, let's say in Discuss. You can set up an approval process that has somebody monitor that particular forum comment and see whether an issue should be raised in Visual Studio Online or in something like Jira. Approvers are also important for things like lead generation. So if a new lead comes in, maybe you want to send an approval process, send them approved, assign somebody on your team to go in and follow up on that approval. As I said earlier, and as we've been saying all week long in the keynotes, as well as in all of our sessions, Flow is the successor to SharePoint Designer workflows. And the most important scenario, and this is something that we've heard from customers, one of the most important scenarios with SharePoint Designer was approvals. And so we've consciously made this effort to invest in a modern approvals experience that meets all of the things that you did in SharePoint Designer and much, much more. So with the modern approvals experience, you can streamline your business processes for data that lives in SharePoint, Dynamics 365, in Microsoft Forms, in SQL, etc. As an approver, you can view all of your received requests. You can also see any requests that you've sent to particular individuals in your organization. Now, these approvals show up in a unified approval center. And when we say unified, what we mean is you're seeing approvals across all services. If you're connecting to SharePoint, it's across all sites, all lists, all libraries. You can also do approvals on the go, which means you can respond to an approval directly from your mobile device. And you'll see the same information that you would see on the web. And using actionable messages, Outlook's actionable messages, you can also do approvals directly from your inbox. And I'll show what that experience looks like up next. Now, approvals can be customized to fit your business process. So you can build sequential or hierarchical approvals. You can build parallel approvals. You can also build approvals where if you assign it to a group of people, each and every one of them must approve before that approval is considered final. Actually, I'm going to go back one second. So the SharePoint team loves us. It's not just me saying that. I think Karam says that pretty often as well. In fact, I think Karam sees more of me than sometimes he sees of his team. So we really do work very closely together. And this love that SharePoint shows us comes in two forms. One is a connector experience, and another is an integration. So in terms of the connector, what we're referring to are the triggers and actions that you see in Flow. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole list, but you'll see here, when we talk about triggers, we have a variety of things. So things like when a file is created, or when a file is modified, when an item is created, when an item is modified. We've also added a new trigger that works when an item is selected in SharePoint. And we'll look at the details in just a minute. In terms of actions, you can copy files, you can create items, you can delete files. We've also recently added attachments, which you can get attachments, delete attachment, etc. Now, some of the recent things that we've just added in the past couple of months, I know many of you have used Flow. We've heard from you loud and clear on the forums, hey, I need support for document library metadata. I need read-write support for native SharePoint column types like people, choice, lookup. I need attachment. So I'm pleased to tell you that in the past couple of months, we've shipped each and every one of those features. Go in and try it right away. But we're still not done yet, right? We still have quite a ways to go when it comes to supporting everything that you would normally do in SharePoint. And we're working on it. In the next few months, this connector will continue to get better and better. We're focusing on things like support for multi-value types. If you have multi-people or if you have multi-choice, etc., we'll have support for that in Flow. We're also working on managed metadata or taxonomy. And towards the end of the year, we'll also have support for content publishing. We also have an integration in both modern lists and libraries. And this integration comes in two forms. You can set up flows that run in the background, which means when an item is created in a list, when a new file is modified, when a new file is added, or you can set up flows that run on a selected item or on a selected file. So what we'll do is when you select that file, you click on Flow and you run a flow. We'll pass the context of the file or item that you've selected. Up next for us in terms of the integration are things like the Flow Launch Panel, which I'll talk about in a second, out-of-box flows that allow you to send for review, as well as content publishing. The Flow Launch Panel. So you can now create flows that prompt your users for information at runtime. These flows run as the user that's starting the flow. So if I run this flow, it'll have my identity, and it'll send this approval request using my credentials. The launch panel will be integrated both into modern lists as well as libraries. And we'll have templates to help you get started, connecting to services like Yammer and Teams and O365 Outlook. But you can go in and create your own flow. If you want to connect to your own custom API, you can do that as well. Now, using the Flow launch panel, we're also going to have an out-of-box flow that allows users to send documents and list items for review. From a user perspective, there will be no setup required whatsoever. So you'll see a menu that says Send for Review. You click on it, you give your credentials, and you're ready to go. Now, in addition to having this integration in SharePoint, which allows you to select an item, we'll also track the status of whether something's been reviewed, whether it's still pending, whether it's been approved or not, directly using a review status column. So let's look at that integration in detail. OK, so I'm here in a document library for legal documents. Let's say in this case, I'm Chris McNulty, attorney at large and extraordinary. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select a document, and I'm going to send it to Jason Moore to get his review. So in this case, I have a presentation here, pending mergers and acquisitions. I'll click on the Flow menu. And as soon as I do that, I see an option show up called Send for Review. Clicking on it is going to open the Flow launch panel on the right-hand side of my window. Let's give that a few seconds. Oh, let's try that again. Ah, there we go. So it prompts me to enter in the email address of a reviewer. We're going to be changing this to be a people picker very soon. It also allows me to type in a message that will be sent to my reviewer. So the thing I want to call out here is that this is actually an embedded experience. So the same experience is also available on the Flow website. So in this case, I'll enter in the email address of my approver, Jason M. And I will send him a message. What do you think? To merge or not to merge? Let me go ahead and run this flow. So what this does is it actually sends an approval request to Jason. Let's open up the Approval Center. So if we go over here, we see an approval request from Chris, and it has details about when this item was requested. It also has the message that was typed in by Chris. What do you think? To merge or not to merge? I'm also given a link where I can go in and review that particular document. In addition, if let's say I wasn't close to my computer, I can actually also approve or reject directly from within my inbox using actionable messages. So here, I see that same information that I have on the website, pending approval from Chris. What do you think? To merge or not to merge? If I click on it, I can actually see the document and make sure that it looks right and it's ready to go. And I'm surprised at how detailed this particular document is. So let me go ahead and click Approve, and I'm going to say, cool. OK. So what's happening is, as soon as I receive that approval request and I responded to it, an email is sent back to Chris letting him know that the item has been approved, and that particular item includes my comments. So let me go ahead and show you what that email looks like. There you go. It says your review request for pending mergers was accepted. And it also has the comments that Jason typed in. So from Jason's inbox, few seconds later, to directly being in Chris McNulty's inbox. And if I refresh SharePoint here, I should see the review status change as well from pending to approved. So let's look a little deeper into how it runs. So in this flow, my trigger is a new trigger that we've just launched called for a selected item. Now in this trigger, I'm going to specify what I'm pointing to. It could be a list. It could be a document library. I'm also specifying inputs like reviewer and message. So you'll notice that these inputs map to what was shown to Chris as he was invoking the flow in SharePoint. So it says, choose who will approve this review request, as well as add a note for the reviewer. Now, in addition, I'm also making a call to update file properties. So in that particular document library, I'm going to set the review status of that file to pending. I'm then going to start an approval request. So in this case, I'm assigning a particular approval to the email address provided by my invoker. I'm also including details like the message provided by the person that invoked this flow. And I also have a link and a link description. I then have a condition. The condition is checking whether the response sent by the approver is equal to approve. Now, the approval connector also gives a few other things. It also shows the name of the approver if you want to address that in your flow, has a request date. It also includes things like the response and, most importantly, the comments. So here, I'm going to go in and update the file properties. I'm going to set it to approved. And I'm going to send an email to the person that invoked this flow. In this case, it was Chris, letting them know that their request for review has been approved and include the comments passed in by the approver. Now, with Flow, you can automate your scenarios for a variety of your business processes. And the more advanced you get, the more advanced your flow is going to also become. One of the design philosophies we have with Microsoft Flow is that we're trying to make the bar lower for users that are attempting to create a flow. So what that means is we try to make the experience as simple as possible. At the same time, we know that business processes are complicated. And when you get processes that are complicated, you also need your workflows to have rich functionality. And so in the past few months, we've been making heavy investments in making sure that Flow has all of the controls that you would expect from a modern workflow engine. For example, we allow you to schedule flows. So you can run a flow at a particular frequency, daily, weekly, monthly, etc. You can have delays within your flows. You can also write expressions. Stephen did a really good session on Wednesday, diving deep into expressions and data types in Flow. I'd really recommend you to go in and check it out. But at a high level, with expressions, you can perform simple inline calculations like string manipulation, substring, replace, index of, etc. You can do arithmetic operations like add, subtract, multiply. You can also do conversions between data types. In addition, with Flow, you can now add switch cases. That's something that a lot of you talk to us about, saying, hey, ifs and if else's are nice, and nested if and else's are nice, but I need a switch case because my flow is really complicated, and I'm dealing with a variety of cases that could happen. So we have switch cases. You can also run flows in parallel, independent of each other. You can create do-until loops as well. So for example, you can monitor a variable and check whether the variable is set to true or not. You can also do looping. So if you have an array of values, you can have it apply to each loop. You can also handle timeouts and failures. And variables, so I mentioned that. Variables is actually a new thing that we've added. You can create variables that are of type Boolean, of type integer, of type string, etc. You can manipulate these variables as well. If you need to increment a variable, for example, and have counters, you can do that in Flow now. Finally, you can also build nested workflows. So what you'll have is parent and child workflows. Your parent workflow makes an HTTP post to your child workflow, which has a request trigger, which allows the flow to run. And we'll look at many of these expressions in the next set of demos. OK, so many a time when you set up a workflow, or you set up an approval flow, you want to send it to multiple people. And what you really care about is that each and every one of those people that you've sent an approval to must approve your particular flow. And sometimes, even when everybody approves, you still need your manager's final sign-off. So the first example that we're going to show you is how you can set up a flow that requires everybody that's assigned to send in an approval request. And we'll see how you can take that approval request and escalate it to a director or a manager. OK, so for the next set of demos, we're going to actually talk about real-life scenarios. This first one is for cover art review. So we're working with a large publication company which has 2 tiers of approvals for reviewing new cover art. So artists upload a new cover image into SharePoint. This then results in an approval request being sent to the legal team, the communication team, as well as the proofreading team. If any of those people in tier 1, legal, comms, proofreading, if any of them decline, the approval is considered as a rejection, and the artist is immediately notified with feedback from any of those parties. If each and every one of those individuals approves, we then send an approval request to the executive editor. If the executive editor approves, it gets sent out to the publishing team. If the executive editor declines, it then gets sent back to the artist. So let's take a look at how we would build a flow like this in Microsoft Flow. OK, so firstly, I want to show you this document library that I have here called Cover Images. And in Cover Images, I have a particular column for showing my review status. So we'll go ahead and add both of these. So I have review status tier 1, review status tier 2, etc. Show you the flow that we built. OK, so what this flow does is it has a trigger when a file is created. So this is actually one of our newer triggers. It allows you to monitor changes on document libraries. When a file is created, and we're getting the properties here in this case, the difference is that you have to do a get file to actually get the content, but that's just one additional step. So in this case, what we're doing is we're monitoring for changes in that document library. When a new file is start an approval. Let me go ahead and change this to everyone from the assigned list. And I'm then going to set a title. Now, let me actually explain the difference between everyone and anyone. So if you select everyone, what that means is if you have a group of approvers that you're sending this request to, each and every one of them has to approve. If any one of them rejects, the approval is considered a rejection. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead with everyone from the assigned list must approve. I'm going to include a title as a cover art review. I'm going to include the name of the file. So the thing I want to call out here is notice how these are all of the properties, these are the columns that were on my document library. And that was one of the pieces of feedback that we received from you, which is how do I get access to my metadata that's in my document library? You can do that now using this brand new trigger. So in this case, I'm going to assign it to Dan, CJ Tan, as well as more. I'm going to include details like who created this particular document, when they did it, and I'll also include a link. If all 3 of the approvers approve, then and only then am I going to update the file properties. So I'm going to set tier 1 to say approved, and I'm going to set tier 2 to say pending. And I'm going to escalate this and send it to Omar Shaheen, who's the final approver in this case. And it'll include the same level of details that I did in my previous step. So similarly, I have a response. If the response is equal to approve, I'll update the file properties, and I'll set tier 2 to say approved. I'll send a mail to the publishing team letting them know that the file is ready to be published. I'll also send an email if somebody says no. I'll send an email to the artist letting them know that it's been rejected and include the comments. And I'll do the same thing on the other side as well. So let me go ahead and click Update Flow. And let's try this in action. So I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to upload a new cover art for our magazine. It's a picture of Iceland. It's a picture somewhere in Iceland, I should clarify. So as soon as that file gets added to that document library, my flow is triggered. It's sent an approval request now. And as Chris in this case, as the fake Chris, the real Chris is actually out in the audience. I can actually see that I can actually go into the Sent Request tab and see that the approval has been sent to Dan Holm, CJ Tan, as well as Jason Moore. So let's go ahead and switch over to Jason's account. He gets this new approval request. Let's go ahead and click Approve. Great. Now, Jason is a man of few words. Cool, great. Let's also send in an approval request as Dan Holm. And finally, let's log in as CJ Tan. And she's going to have a look at the document, and for whatever reason, she's actually going to say no. So she thinks that this should actually be color. It's March, it's spring, and we want to make our cover art as colorful as possible. So she's going to say, I want you to go with the color option. Go ahead and click well, I guess CJ doesn't get to say anything. So go ahead and hit no. Now what happens with our flow is as soon as that rejection is received, the flow is considered as a rejection. We'll go into the no path. We'll update the file properties and say that this particular item has been rejected. So review status is set to rejected. And if we scroll down, we'll also send an email out to Chris letting him know about the details of each of those approval requests. So you can both get a summary of those responses, and you can also get each individual response. Thank you. Now, I actually wanted to take this moment to point out one additional thing. So my choice fields here are actually coming in directly from SharePoint. So in SharePoint, I set these values on that column to be approved, rejected, and pending. If I wanted them to be orange, black, and blue, I could set them in SharePoint, and Flow, when it connects to your list or your document library, is going to show those same exact values directly in Flow. So let's recap. So I had a particular SharePoint document library. It was when we set up a flow that was watching for changes for new files that were added to that document library. As soon as a new file was added, we started a tier 1 approval. And it was an almost approved in this case, so it sent it out to 3 people. And Flow actually handled whether each person approved or rejected. So as a user, you don't have to think about, did everybody approve, and do some sort of join and try to figure out what people said. We took care of that for you. Now, if everybody said approve, we then marked tier 1 as approved. We then started a tier 2 approval, and we sent it to Omar. If Omar approved, we then sent out we then updated SharePoint and marked tier 2 as approved, and also notified the publisher. Similarly, if tier 1 said no, or if tier 2, Omar, rejected the request, we'll notify the artist, letting them know that they still need to make more design changes before they can submit the document. Okay. Now, sometimes you don't need a scenario where everybody needs to approve. You don't necessarily want to run in a sequence, but instead you want to run a flow that runs in parallel. And what that means is you want to send an approval request to multiple individuals, and you care about what each individual has said, and you want to get the response as soon as possible. So we were working with a company called the Lind Group. They're headquartered in Munich. They're a leading gas and engineering company with operations in over 100 countries. They're a really large Office 365 shop. And as a result of being such a large company, they have an IT team that prepares training materials and tips and tricks for users on emerging technology. In fact, when they reached out to us, they were working on a guidance document for Flow. So it's like flow, within a flow, about a flow, flowception. So what they needed was a parallel workflow for every new document that gets added to a particular document library. Right? So this is every time there's new guidance on an emerging technology. If it's about Power Apps, about Flow, it's about Teams, et cetera. What they want to do is they want to send a parallel request to 3 different approvers. Approver 1, Approver 2, and Approver 3. As each approver responds, they want to get that feedback piped out back to the author so that they can make changes. Let's see what that flow looks like. Yes, I got the AV right this time. So let me first show you the document library that we're going to be uploading to. In this case, it's very simple. It just has the standard fields, name, modified, modified by. I'm going to upload a document into this document library. And let me go ahead and show you what this flow does. So in this case, I'm using another new trigger called when a file is created or modified. Now, I could have used another trigger called when a file is created, but I use this intentionally to show you a neat trick that you could use. By adding a condition where you check whether the modified is equal to created, you can actually verify whether the document is a brand new document. If it isn't, it means that it's a modification, and you can handle that explicitly. In this case, I've just terminated the flow, but you could very well have a different review process, which maybe just notifies approvers, letting them know that the document was modified. In the yes branch, I have a delay, and I'll explain why I have a delay in just a second. More importantly, what I'm doing is I'm kicking off 2 parallel approval requests. So one that gets sent out to Dan, and another that gets sent out to Jason Moore. Now, each of these approvers can approve independently, and as they approve, an email is immediately sent out to the person that's requesting that feedback. Now, a question you might ask is, well, what if I want these? What if I don't know ahead of time how many approvers I'll have? Can I build a flow where my list of approvers is dynamic? And the answer is absolutely. What you can do is you can actually set up a for each loop which runs in parallel instead of sequentially. And in that case, that for each loop could actually iterate over a list of approvers. So for the sake of the demo, we've kept it simple. We have a very rigid review process here, so we know that I have 2 sets of approvers that I want to get feedback from. So here I have my parallel flow. If I want, I can also add another parallel branch and do the same thing and start an approval process, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and click Update Flow. And we'll see this flow in action. So here, it says Guidance on Approvals and Flow. And this change is detected. It knows that this particular document is a brand new document in this document library. It's going to delay for a few seconds, and then it's going to send a parallel approval request, one to Jason and another to Dan. So So let me go ahead and switch to Jason's profile here. So I see here that he got a particular approval request. Let me go ahead and click approve. This looks great. Please go ahead and share with the team. We'll all just wait with bated breath while this is going on. There we go. Now, as soon as that approval request is processed, you'll notice that a new branch lit up. And that's because these flows are running in parallel. So we're not actually waiting on Dan to go in and review this approval request or review this document. As soon as Jason has responded, that feedback is sent back to the requester, who in this case is Chris. So you notice here, it says yes, it sends the email and also includes the feedback that Jason sent along. Now similarly, if you go over to Dan's profile here, he's going to go ahead and he's actually going to look at it and he's going to say reject. He's going to say, have to talk a little more about parallel approvals. Guy named Marwan has a demo on it at Ignite. Include it for reference. Let me go ahead and click confirm. Now again, this flow runs in parallel to the previous response. As soon as it's received, this flow will update and will include feedback that Dan sent along and send it back to the original requester. There we go. Now while I'm here, I actually also want to take this opportunity to point out another cool new feature that we've added to Flow. And that's the ability to add co-owners. So let's say I'm working on this flow, I'm working within the enterprise in Lind, and this flow starts to become critical to my business. Maybe I want IT to take over, maybe I want to share it with someone else in the IT team so that they can also go in and further refine this flow. So you can do that actually by adding another owner. So when you click, you can actually add any other individual in your enterprise and add security groups as well. So let's review our flow one more time. So again, I had a document library. I was watching for changes in a flow. As soon as a new file was uploaded to that document library, I started 2 parallel approval requests, right? One that was sent to Dan, another that was sent to Jason. As soon as each of those approvers responded, I then notified the author of the approval or rejection. Now sometimes, when you send out an approval request, your manager is just incredibly busy. They just don't have the time to give you approval or rejection, right? Because they're on vacation, they're busy with a presentation, or they're frankly, they need more information. So what you can do is you can actually set up an approval, a workflow process, which sends out a reminder for a given approval. You can also set up a flow such that it escalates it and sends out a request to somebody else. And if they don't respond within a certain time frame, it sends out another approval request, and so forth and so on. So we were working with an organization based in Suffolk County, New York, the Visiting Nurse Service and Hospice of Suffolk. What they do is they offer nurses, physical therapists, social workers, and dietitians to patients that are recently discharged from hospitals. So this spans from people that have just gotten out of surgery to people that are more serious and are, for example, in hospice care. Now, what they wanted was an approval process for incident reports filed by healthcare workers. For example, imagine that one of the patients under your care has had a fall, for instance. So what they want is an incident report gets filed. Today, it's actually an InfoPath form that gets created, and users enter their information. As soon as that incident is filed, it then sends an approval request to the manager of that particular healthcare worker. The responsibility of that manager is to verify that that particular healthcare worker responded in an appropriate fashion and that the right care was taken and dispensed to the patient. So if the manager approves, You notify the healthcare worker, letting them know of the feedback. If, for example, the manager doesn't respond within 3 days, you then escalate that approval. So you send it to the manager and the director. And if they respond within 3 days, great, you notify the nurse. But if they don't, in 2 days, you then send them another reminder. And you send them another reminder. And you keep on pinging them until they give their feedback. And you can actually determine how often you want to ping them. It could be 10 times, it could be 20 days, whatever comes first. So let's take a look at what that flow looks like. Now, before we do that, I also want to point out what this incident report looks like. So I want to talk about all the forms. You'll notice that it has fields like patient ID, it has incident, it has incident details, etc. All of these fields can actually be referenced in the flow and passed along as an approval request. So let's see what that flow looks like in detail. OK. In this case, I'm pointing to a list. We'll give it a few seconds here. We're pointing to an incident reports list. In this case, for the sake of the demo, I've actually simplified the list. And we've included just a few key fields instead of including everything that was included in the form. And what I'm doing here is I'm getting the manager of the person that created that approval or created that incident report. I'm then initializing a variable. And this is actually something that's brand new. Again, a lot of you have asked for this. And if John White's in the audience, this is for you, man, wherever you are. So you can actually set types of Boolean, integer, float, string, object, array. So for example, if it's an integer, you can go in and increment the variable. If it's a string, for example, you can go in and change it. In this case, we're going to use an integer. And we're going to set it to the value 0. And later on, we'll change it to 1. So 0 means that the approval hasn't been processed yet. If it's equal to 1, it means that this particular approval request has been processed. OK? So I've initialized my variable. I start an approval request. It's going to be to anyone from the assigned list. I'm going to include a descriptive title. I'm going to include the title of the list item. I'm going to include details like the type of the incident as well as the incident summary. So whatever my healthcare worker typed into the form, I'll also include a link to that particular request. Now, if they respond yes or no, then the flow will work, and we'll handle it appropriately down there, and we'll get back to it. But if for some reason the flow, if somebody doesn't respond within a period of 3 days, I then want to set up a series of pings. Now, the way I can set an expiry for my approval is by clicking on the ... menu. I'm serious, that's what we call it. We don't have a name for it. It's the ... menu. So click on the ... menu. We go to settings. And you can set a duration for your particular approval request. So in this case, I'm setting it for 3 days, PT3D. This uses the ISO 8601 format. We will be improving this in the future so that you have a drop down. But for now, you have to type in this value here. So I'll set an expiry time of 3 days. And when I was testing this, it was actually 30 seconds. I couldn't wait for 3 days. But what I'm then going to do is I'm going to have a do until loop. And here, I'm using what's known as the configure run after dialog. In the configure run after, I can say that run this particular loop and everything encased in it if and only if the approval request has timed out. So after 3 days, I'm going to enter this loop. And I'm going to wait to see if the isApproved variable is equal to 1. What that means is I'm going to wait until this approval request has been processed by my approvers. So in that case, I'm going to start an approval request. I'm going to escalate this. I'm going to include the manager. And I'm going to go into CJ Tan, who's the director for this unit. Again, I'm going to include the same information that I had earlier, the incident type, the summary. If, and in this case, I'm actually going to set a timeout of 2 days. So remember, the first time the approval request is sent out, it's 3 days. The next time, because things are getting more serious, things are getting more urgent, I'm going to set a timeout of 2 days. So I'm then going to run the set variable step. And this step runs only if the previous step has timed out, right? And what we're doing here is we're saying that, hey, the approval request still hasn't been processed, setting that variable to be 0. Now, what that does is it actually sends me back into the loop. So it starts this process all over again. And that first approval request is actually deleted, and a new approval request is created with that same information. Now, if, for example, CJ or the manager of the person that filed this request approves or rejects, the set variable step will actually be skipped, in which case we'll actually enter the condition here. So in this case, if the set variable is skipped, I'll enter this step. If the response is equal to approve, I'm going to go in and update my SharePoint list and say that the incident review looks good, everything is ready to be approved, or I can also go in and hit reject. But also, I'm going to go ahead and set my isApproved variable to say 1, which means that this particular approval request has been looked at and somebody has said approved or rejected, right? So in this case, what it's saying is that this particular approval request has been processed, and therefore, you can actually get out of this loop. Now, a few other things that I want to point out. With this particular loop, you can actually also set limits. So you can define how many times you want this flow to run. So it could be 10 times, it could be 11 times, 12 times, et cetera. And you can also set a timeout. So run for a maximum frequency of, let's say, 20 days. So just to round off this flow, I alluded to this earlier. I have a condition at the bottom of this flow. Now, this condition is going to run if the do until loop is skipped, right? So what that means is an approval request was sent to the very first approver. They actually did respond, approve or reject. There was no timeout. And so the do until loop was skipped. And it sent a condition. I'm going to look at the response. The response is equal to approve. I'm going to go ahead and update the SharePoint list and say that the item was approved or rejected. So a pretty complicated flow. Let's look at it in a little bit more detail. So once again, I was pointing to SharePoint. I built a flow over it. I was watching for changes that got added, so any new list items. As soon as a new list item was added, I got the manager of that particular uploader. I set a variable called isApproved. It merely tells me how and whether this particular approval request has been processed or not. I then start an approval request with a manager. If they approve or reject within 3 days, great. You're going to go ahead and mark the item as approved and inform the nurse or the healthcare worker, letting them know that this particular item has been approved. Same thing with rejection as well. If they don't respond in 3 days, I'm then going to check whether the isApproved variable has been set to yes or not. And until it's set, I'm going to keep on looping. And when I loop, I'm going to check if the isApproved variable is set to yes, great, the flow terminates. Someone has processed this approval, and I'm done. If it's equal to no, which means that nobody has responded yet, I'll start an escalation. I'll include the manager and the director. And if one of them responds, then great, the item is marked as approved or rejected. I set the variable isApproved to yes, and I terminate the loop. If for some reason, again, within 2 days, if the manager and the director do not respond, I'll set the isApproved equal to no, and we'll loop back and go through this entire process over and over again. So I know this flow was a little complicated. We'll get to questions at the end. So I know this flow was a little complicated, but the idea here was to demonstrate that using flow and using some of the advanced constructs like do until and configure run after and setting explicit approval expiries, you can actually model a workflow. You can create a flow that matches your business process. So let's take a look at how does flow compare to SharePoint Designer workflow. You know, that's what this session is all about. That's what the title is. So let's get to it in the 15 minutes that we have. So one of the beauties about flow, one of the things that really stands out again, SharePoint Designer and really any workflow service for enterprise services is the ability to connect to dozens and dozens of data sources. So it's over 150. With SharePoint Designer, you were restricted to a handful. We have out-of-box templates that range into the hundreds. With Designer, you were restricted to a few. You have approvals over mobile and mobile notification. That's something that wasn't available in SharePoint Designer. In Flow, it's built in from the get-go. You can get notifications. You can do approvals from iOS, from Android, and from Windows Phone. You can also do your approvals directly from the comfort of your Outlook inbox, as we saw today. And we're also adding a history tab very soon so that you can see and get a history of all of the approvals that were done, both as an individual and eventually also as an administrator. We have advanced workflow concepts like loops and do until and switch case, parallels with variables. These are nearly the same between both SharePoint Designer and Flow. We also have support for extended field types like people, choice, lookup, multimedia, or managed metadata is coming soon. We allow you to send an email both as a user as well as a system. And that's actually one of the questions that comes up very frequently. How do you send an email as a system account? Well, there's two ways. One is you can use the built-in action that I showed today. It's called mail. Or alternatively, you can also create a service account and log in as that service account into a particular action. So you don't have to log into Flow as that particular service account, but just into a given action. You can also do attachments, and that's something that we just shipped a couple of weeks ago. So you can actually get attachments for a list item. You can delete them. You can upload them, etc. So how are we different, and how does that lead into the roadmap? So there's a few things. As I mentioned earlier, this is an area that we will continue to invest in. It's definitely something that's of very high value to us. And we work very closely with Khurram and Chris on making sure that we're filling as many of these gaps as possible. So we'll have out-of-box send for review flows. This was a little limited in SharePoint Designer, but it's something that we will be providing in Flow this quarter itself. We announced it this week. It's something that will start to roll out into first release in the next couple of weeks. We'll also improve and strengthen and ameliorate our approvals experience. So starting with the ability to reassign. So if an approval request is sent to you, you feel like you don't have enough information, you'll be able to reassign it to somebody else. And in the future, this will also automatically do it for you, for example, if you're out of office. We'll set up approval reminders out of the box, which means that if you send an approval request and you set a timeout of, let's say, 10 days, if somebody doesn't respond within 2 days, you can send them an approval reminder. We'll also have input forms for approvers. So what that means is, so far what you saw me do was whenever I hit approve or reject, I typed in a comment. But sometimes when you hit reject, for example, you might actually want to select from an enum value, and you want to maybe provide a reason for why you're rejecting, a standard reason, maybe not enough information, form wasn't filled out correctly, etc. We'll also be making improvements to the connector. So we'll add capabilities like check-in, check-out, document content publishing as well. We're also working on approver impersonation, which means that today, when a flow runs, it either uses the person that it either uses the maker's credentials, or it involves and uses the invoker's credentials. In the future, we're actually going to also include the approver's credentials as well. So what that means is, if, for example, a new page is a content publishing request is sent out, and an approval request is requested, when an approver says yes, in SharePoint, we're actually going to update that item and mark it for publishing using the approver's credentials. We'll also be adding things like site-level actions and allow you to set permissions on a given item. So all of this is coming. I invite you to stay tuned, and if you want to submit your own ideas or even see what's out there, you can head over to our forum, powerusers.microsoft.com/t5/flowideas. I won't read the rest of it, but you have it on there on the deck. OK, so if there's one message that I'd like to leave you with, is that if you're building new workflows for your business, especially with SharePoint, use Flow. OK, so we've talked about approvals. We've talked about SharePoint. We've talked a little bit about the roadmap for each of those things. What about Flow in general? As you can see here, we've had a busy H2 calendar, and it's only going to get busier in 2018. So in H2 this year, we gave you the ability, excuse me, gave you the ability to export, import packages across environments. So what that means is you could have an environment for development or testing or production. You can build your flows and Power Apps and then export them across environments. In fact, the flows that I showed you today were all actually built using my own tenant, my Microsoft tenant, and then I exported it into these demo tenants last night. You will also have in the box or out of the box, whatever terminology you want to use, send for review flows. We'll be adding more capabilities in SharePoint, like content publishing. We added multi-choice and we added people choice in this semester already. We'll be adding multi-values in a little bit. We'll also have an integration similar to our SharePoint integration in Dynamics 365. So you'll be able to select a lead, for example, and send it for approval or send an email on it. We will be adding embedded Power BI analytics. And this applies both to Flow creators as well as Flow admins. So you'll be able to get details about how your Flow is being used in terms of the successes, in terms of the failures. And as an administrator, you'll be able to see what kind of services people are using within your organization. So are they using SharePoint? Are they using SharePoint in approvals? What is the usage of Dynamics 365, for instance? What are some of the more common errors, et cetera? We just announced Office 365 audit logs. So what that means is, as an administrator, as a tenant administrator, or if you have the ability to review reports, you'll be able to see which flows were created in your organization, which flows were edited, deleted, et cetera. In 2018, some of the highlights, we'll be adding a rich text editor so that you can very easily create your emails and have things like bolds, italics, and what have you. I know typing in those tags can get a little annoying sometimes, but we hear you, and we're going to make that process easier. We're also going to make our debugging and condition story easier. So we'll make it easier for you to build flows, test them, as well as debug what may have gone wrong. We're also making investments in ALM. So we'll have sandbox environments. We'll allow you to move or copy directly across environments instead of having to import and export packages. Another thing that I'll mention here is government and sovereign cloud support. And that's something that comes up very often. Hey, I work with governments. I'm at a university, or I'm at a local government. Can I use Flow? The answer is, in 2018, we'll be adding support for both of those. So I know we're at the end of Ignite, but I did want to talk about some of the other sessions. If you haven't seen them, I'd invite you to go back home and check out the videos, especially as this recording is being done as well. Do go and check out some of these other sessions. Anjali, one of my colleagues, did an intro session to Flow. Steven, the GPM of Flow, did a really good deep dive on various workflow concepts, as well as data types and expressions. We also talked about extensibility. So my colleague Sunay, Tessa, and Asavri did a session talking about how you can build your own custom connector and expose it to users of Power Apps and Flow. And finally, there were some sessions on Power Apps, as well as a detailed session on administration and ALM practices by James Olenek. So that brings us to an end. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you coming out here. Please do evaluate this session. If you loved it, give me 5 stars. If you didn't like it, still give me 5 stars. Just go in and give a session. Thank you very much. So yeah, we'll take questions. If you can come up to the mic, I'd really appreciate it. And Karem, if you could also come on stage and help me with some of the SharePoint questions. Yes, please.
A very annoying limitation in SharePoint Designer 2013 was that you couldn't make a workflow lookup on a lookup column where multiple choices were allowed. Has that been handled in Flow now?
Yeah, so the question was, one of the limitations in SharePoint Designer 2013 was you couldn't do a lookup on columns that had multi-choice values, right? Graham, do you want to take that particular one?
Well, the multi-value choices are not quite supported in Flow yet, so that's our position. That is one of the things that we should make available once the multi-value support is there.
That's much appreciated because it's much in demand.
Right, right. So once multi-value is there, hopefully by end of this year, that scenario will be enabled.
Great. We'll take the next question from the middle. Yes.
So the three little dots, it's called an ellipse.
Yes.
Just to let you know.
Thank you. Thank you.
So
Isn't ... cooler though? ...
Yeah.
Schooled.
English minor. That's it. So the REST API. So I built a number of SharePoint Designer workflows that run multiple workflows based on different things that happen during like a contract life, right? Using the REST API, pulling in lots of different types of information, whether it's multiple different approval levels depending on multiple criteria. Is that supported in Flow as well?
Yes, so in terms of custom connectors, absolutely. There's actually, again, I mentioned a session, but if you go in, you can actually go in and create your own custom connector and then deploy it so that everyone in your organization can make use of the functionality that you've written. There's a pretty straightforward process to do. And I'll also call out, if there's a particular capability that you see that the SharePoint connector doesn't have, for instance, now something that we're working on, you can actually extend it yourself. So again, you can build a custom connector. You can also build an Azure function and then use that as a custom connector. There's a very, very cool GitHub sample that somebody released from the MVP community that allows you to take a sample in GitHub, create an Azure function out of it, and they walk you through how you can create a custom connector as well. So certainly that's definitely doable.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'll take another question here.
Okay, so in the approvals, since with the reminders you delete the old approvals or they end and you make the new approvals, that does mean that, say, the manager clicks the wrong email, an older email, none of those approval buttons will work anymore, right?
Yes, yes. So the question was, and I'll repeat it, I know it was on the mic, what happens if an approval request is sent and it gets deleted because of a timeout and another approval request is sent? What happens in the email when you click on it? So the answer there is actually we provide a useful error message. We say, hey, this particular approval request has expired, and you can go in as an approver and go and look at the latest request.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yes.
Yep. In current SharePoint Designer, there is a support for project server workflows as well. So are we going to get the same support in Flow at some point as well?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
In SharePoint Designer, for the workflows, there is a separate feature or an option to create a project server related workflows, which are slightly or actually largely different than our typical SharePoint list workflows.
Right.
Are we going to get the same in Flow at some point? Because what's currently happening is if we are creating SharePoint workflows in Flow, the approvals and everything else, everything is different. The whole process of going through the approval is different, whereas at the same time, in the world of Project Online, the project workflows, they are completely different. They're going into the typical SharePoint task list, and the whole approval process is also different. So it's the practical world outside the demo world is really difficult to convey it to the customer that these two things are the same, like they're stays in the same world, but the activity, the actions are happening are completely different. So the question is just that are we going to get this in Flow at some point as well? Is it in the future line?
That's a great question. We've been talking to the project folks for supporting the SharePoint workflow side of it. We did not specifically talk about how it would integrate with Flow yet. Okay. It's a very good point, and I'll make a note for myself when I go back to dig into that some more. The Project Online, I think we have a connector right now.
We do have a connector for it, that's correct.
So I think the better way for Project would be to extend the connector for Flow and then start to onboard the processes of approvals for project workflows over onto the Flow using the Project Online connector.
Yeah,
I'm sure there's a lot of detail that we will need
that's
to
what
figure
I
out.
So that's fine.
Yeah. Yes, thank you for making that note.
Sure.
We had not started that process, but yes, we should.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yes, hi, thank you. I've got a handful of use case scenarios, maybe 4 or 5 that I'm kind of struggling with. How do I achieve this, or how do I accomplish that with Flow? And I don't want to hog the mic for too long. So what's the best way to get some support on specific scenarios that you need help with? Is there a community forum?
Yeah.
Can I get your email? Like, how,
Yeah,
how can
yeah,
I achieve
absolutely.
this?
Yeah, you can do either of those. Let's definitely follow up offline. I'll give you my email. But there is actually a community forum as well. I will actually just open it up real quickly. And
It is
point
under
you to it.
flowmicrosoft.com. So under flowmicrosoft.com, under Learn, there's the community link.
Yeah.
And then you'll be able to get in there. And we're pretty active there. We monitor
Oh,
this.
excellent.
We
Yep.
look for ideas.
Yep.
So
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, as Karam said, this is something that we monitor daily. In fact, we have two on-call engineers that go through these forums every week. Karam and I are on it, the rest of the PM team as well. Definitely go in here and ask your questions, and we're happy to help you. We also have a customer success team that works with various enterprises and helps them become successful. So let's definitely follow up offline. We'd love to
That's
help.
great. Thank you so much. I
Yeah,
appreciate
absolutely.
it.
Yeah. Thanks. Yes.
Yeah, so can we grab like assigners from a list based on the document metadata value?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, so the question was, can we grab approvers dynamically based on some metadata that's part of the document? And the answer to this, yes, absolutely, you can. Yeah.
So how you would do that is probably you look at the metadata and then you do a lookup into a list or a library doing get files or get items, and then you can pass in a filter parameter. It's not beautiful as it should be, but it works. I've used it on several occasions, so yes.
Okay, that
I
is
think we have
possibly-
some samples in the forums, but,
Okay.
if you put a question there, we'll kind of update it and tell you how it can be done.
Okay, that is very easy in SharePoint Designer. So
Yes,
that's why, yeah.
it's much easier in SharePoint Designer. Hopefully, we'll get there someday in Flow.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Yeah, I would start with thank you. One of the best sessions I really enjoyed. I'll
Thank
give
you.
you 5 stars.
Thank you.
So, my question is, since you encourage people to build any flow on Microsoft Flow,
Yep.
so what's going to happen with flows built on SharePoint Designers
Yep.
on-prem?
Yep.
So,
SharePoint Designer workflows will continue to run. We're not going to be just like stopping the service and taking it away. But you should know that we are not adding any innovation here. Like that platform is not really going forward and getting better over time, right? And there's several limitations, as you may know. You're stuck to the same site collection. You can't send mail as someone else. You can't connect to all these other data services that you can with Flow. So it is there. It will continue to work. We're not going to be yanking it away, or making it stop working anytime in the foreseeable future. But we want people to start building on Flow because we think that's the future. That's where we're going.
So the official support statement, because I've written it, just to be clear, is SharePoint Designer workflows running on SharePoint Server 2016 are supported for 5+5, 5 years of primary and 5 years of extended support running to 2026. We treated the release of SharePoint 2016 last year as if we had made new versions of the product. So for on-premises, you have 9 more years to get your stuff all into Flow, and for us to finish closing off any additional gaps so that we can make sure you do that.
so that means you recommend that every workflow is running on SharePoint Designer to start recreated on Flow, Microsoft Flow. To rebuild it from scratch.
Yes, there's not a direct transfer, right, of the workflow definition that you can automatically import into Flow. There may be third parties working on such things, but that's not something that we're looking at.
So the last question, when you say like you're going to be supporting the SharePoint Designer through 2026, that means after 26 there is no workflow software will be available?
After 2026, SharePoint Server 2016 itself will be out of support,
Oh, okay.
right? Because when we do on-premises releases, it's 5+5,
Yeah.
Standard 5 extended support.
right? So,
Just like with any other.
and you can continue, people continue to run XP, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't magically shut off in the middle of the night, although it could because it's not supported. And if it does, which
Yeah,
is
I
not
got
to say
your
that
point.
in the interim, if there are things to expand on Karam's point, We are not investing in this. However, it is still a supported platform. So if we need to make updates for security reasons, for example, absolutely. I mean, you're supported on this. But we want to make sure you're clear that this is to help smooth the transition into the next generation of tools.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
So Chris kind of answered my first question, which no export option of legacy SharePoint Designer workflows into Flow. My second question is, we have a lot of Dilbert scenarios where we tell the client what their requirements are. So I'm wondering, is there any kind of option to export your Flow workflows into something like Visio, where after I build the workflow, I can show them this is what your workflow looks like?
That's a good question. Currently, there's actually no way to export to Visio. We know a lot of people actually end up using Visio and kind of doing it manually.
I see a partner opportunity there.
Yes, but yes, I was about to say that. There is definitely a partner opportunity to do that.
Can you name that after me, please? Thank you.
Yes.
Will you or are you supporting groups as your approver?
Yes, so the question was, will we be supporting groups? Currently, we don't, but that's definitely something that's on our backlog, something we plan to address in the future.
So like security groups?
Yes, yes.
From the people pick?
Exactly, that's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes?
Hi, is it possible now or in the future to be able to package up a flow so that you can distribute it to a client
Yes.
on a completely different tenant?
Yes, that's an excellent question. Is it possible to package up a flow and distribute it to clients? And the answer is absolutely yes. So you can take a flow, you can export it. We create a zip package, which you can then go in and import. And it just creates your flow, and you tell it which connections to use, and that's how the flow is ready.
Yeah, there are some caveats there where, it won't just work, right?
Well,
you still need to go in and update the values
Yeah.
of things.
Right.
So,
So can you do that programmatically, or does it have to be imported manually?
it is by hand, if I'm not mistaken.
I'm sorry,
Can you
what
do
was
it
it?
programmatically?
No, you can't do it programmatic. It is by hand.
Is there a plan to do that? When you've got fully automated deployments.
Yeah.
So also, we actually do have an API. We haven't publicly documented yet, but if you reach out to Marwan or myself, I can send you a Word doc that describes how to do it. So we want to make it possible for people. And if you went to James Olnick's ALM session earlier in the week, he actually is working on a bunch of PowerShell scripts that will do it as well. So you'll be able to do it from PowerShell API, and that's coming imminently. Technically, you could do it now.
Great, thank you very much.
Sweet, yes.
Two questions.
Yeah.
The first one is scheduling for flows. Is that already in GA or is that something?
Yes, yes,
okay,
it's already in GA, so you can go in and use it, yes.
Thank you. The second question is, you said one of the features that is yet to come in the future is being able to set permissions on list items.
Mhm.
And that's something we use quite often in our approval workflows and our traditional approval workflows. Is there a way to call SharePoint Designer workflows from a flow if you need to use features like that until it rolls out?
Yeah, that's a, well.
There isn't
Yeah.
yet. We are looking at, one of the things we're investigating right now is to create an HTTP.
There's a hack.
Oh.
Okay.
There's a hack you can use, which is if you trigger a SharePoint, so if you build your SharePoint Designer flow to look at some other object, like a list, and you're basically using that as a lightweight queue, and then you have a flow process which inserts a record into that list, and Designer sees that as the trigger to go do something.
Okay.
I've seen people use that as a workaround, and it's probably going to be the cleanest thing than coming up with some arcane state machine way of doing it.
Right.
In the interim, that's probably my best suggestion for you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
That is a good idea.
Yes, sir.
Are there any ways where a flow can be triggered by an email?
Yes, yes. So we do have a trigger that says on new email. It uses your O365 credentials, and you can point it to any folder in your inbox.
So would that require some sort of an email-enabled list or document library?
No, it actually just uses your Exchange Online credentials.
And you can provide some filters to it, so you can make it trigger off of a word in the subject line if only that word is there. Or you can also define a folder path in your inbox and say if an email goes into that folder, it will trigger it.
So you can do some sort of an analysis through the flow
Yes.
of the text and maybe put it in certain folders?
Yes,
based on
yes, yes, absolutely. Yes, you can parse through the subject or the body, see if it contains a particular value, and then route it to upload the file to a particular document library.
Okay, but you would have to have like the email and everything set up and have Flow kind of be able to work with that, right?
Correct. That's correct. Yeah.
Does it work against a group's mailbox?
It does work against a shared
Okay,
mailbox,
so
yeah.
a shared mailbox could be set up. So that would be one way to make it independent of a single user, for example.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
2 questions. So my first one is, I have no idea about Flow. So my question is, if you have an approval group such as legal, can you restrict their feedback or the access to their feedback? So that their legal team can view it, but other people in the organization can't.
So specifically, are you referring to the approval request or to the
Yes,
flow?
the approval request.
So today, the approval request is, as an approver, you get to see the approval requests that are sent to you, and you also get the ability to see the requests that you've sent. I think what you're referring to is more sort of like a CC option, or having somebody just giving them read-only something. It's something that's come up. That's something that we're thinking about doing in the future. Currently, that's not on our backlog.
Okay. And so as far as the owner of the flow, are they're the only ones that can view that feedback?
So it's basically on the approval request. So if you're the approver, you can see the approval request, and if I'm the requester, I can see what I've sent.
Okay.
In the future, we're also going to have admin capabilities, so that somebody can go in and see approval requests across their organization.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. And then the other question is, I'm a G tenant. I have MSDN E tenants. So when you said that there's no government support, what did you mean by that?
Stephen, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, the short answer is that we are not currently deployed in the government cloud. You can use the commercial offerings of any Office 365 service technically, even though you have a G tenant. It does not come with the same compliance guarantees, particularly FedRAMP.
Okay.
So, and as you can imagine, getting FedRAMP compliance is kind of a long and involved process.
Right.
So until that happens, you could choose to use a commercial offering, assuming that meets your compliance requirements. Otherwise, you have to wait for that to be completed.